The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
It's very nice to be here tonight, and the lecture may be a little bit different from what you were expecting, because this is what I'm really planning to talk about. Basically, to think about all the things that have gone wrong with Christians in American society and what I would not really want to see happening in Singapore. And I'll explain a bit the rationale for this now. So, when the ex-president that I like to refer to as he whom we do not name, when he was elected in 2016, a number of Singaporeans told me that this was going to be God's blessing for America. I said, fine, you think so? You go live there. I said, I prefer to stay here under Lee Hsien Loong, who is, I think, going to be a much better leader than that man. So to have sort of Singaporeans telling me what they thought was going to be best for my country was a little bit of a shock. Then more recently, we were probably aware that there were people during the COVID that were trying to dose themselves with the veterinary drug, which was, there's only one place they could ever have gotten such a silly idea, and that was from America and from American Christians. My concern, because I grew up in, when my formative years were in the 1980s, when Christianity really was starting to become politicized in the US. And I was a university student from freshman year to the end of my PhD was for 12 years, from 78 to 90. And then, as Ming Chu said, almost the entire time since then, I have been living overseas, and so I have been looking back at American Christianity and what's going on at home, and often it's quite horrifying. And one of the things that has worried me in recent years is I think that a lot of brothers and sisters in Singapore take what's going on in America and among American Christians probably a bit too seriously. And I worry that we see a lot of ideas, and obviously there are good things. There are good Christian leaders, there are good preachers, there are good music in the States, but there are also an awful lot of what I call wacko ideas floating around out there. And so I think there are a lot of lessons that Christians in Singapore can learn, and many of them are negative lessons. Now, the US and Singapore, of course, are two very different places. But at the same time, I think sometimes we do learn things by watching how others have mucked things up and say that, we do not want to do that way in our situation. And so as someone, because I teach history of Christianity to Singaporean undergraduates, and I have a fairly strong component on American Christianity to try to help them make sense of it. And so I'm used to standing up and talking fairly critically about my own religion in my own country. And so I want to do that today, but not so much as just a critique of American Christianity, but again, what can we learn about? If there are positives, I will try to bring them out. But to be honest, I don't see very many in the last few years. And certainly there are negatives that I think we want to be very careful not to see coming into Singaporean society. Now, I realized when I started putting this lecture together that in order to talk about the present, I have to talk about the past. Now, this is also natural because I'm a historian, and I usually tell people I can't even get up and introduce myself without talking about the past. I almost never, when I preach at church, I almost always include some history in it. But here, if we want to understand how particularly evangelical Christianity, has developed in the US in the last few decades, we have to understand the history behind it. So roughly almost the first half of the lecture is actually going to be a history lesson, but I think will be a useful one to help us to understand the backdrop for what has happened. And then I will focus more specifically on more recent years. So let's start with the history. Now, of course, one of the major problems with any Protestantism in any country is that we love to split. Vociferous is a word that I use with my history students. My normal principle is that every lecture you should have at least one CHEAM term that will be completely useless anywhere else. And vociferous, we use vociferous to talk about early Southeast Asia, meaning that early Southeast Asian countries split apart very easily. One of the things that our Catholic brethren have always criticized Protestants for, quite rightly, is that we split, right? And so, of course, Protestantism, American Protestants have continued to split historically over the years. And starting with the fact that pretty much every denomination, every variety of Protestant Christianity that exists in Europe was imported through immigration into the US, and then going beyond that, the denominations continued to split beyond that. The Bible Presbyterians, which our BP Church in Singapore is not directly connected to the American BP Church, but the American BP Church, if I'm not wrong, split off from the Orthodox Presbyterians, who had split off from the Reformed Presbyterians, who had split off from the Maine Presbyterians, who had split off from the Southern Presbyterians back in the Civil War. And that's just the Presbyterians. So as we know, I mean, there is a lot of division, and that means that division means diversity. Sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not. Also, the fact that basically in the US, we don't have a registrar of societies, right? Anybody can go out and start a church, and as long as you can convince the government that you're doing something more or less religious, you get your tax-free status, and that's all that matters. And so therefore we have a wide variety of religious groups and organizations that would probably never ever make it past the standards of the ROS here. They can go ahead and operate for better or for worse in the US. So over the years, or over the decades, some of the key things that have divided Protestants were slavery, for example. If you go back to the Civil War in the mid-19th century, almost every single American Protestant denomination split into a northern denomination and a southern denomination over the issue of slavery. Some of them only reunited in recent years, and some of them simply never reunited. Sometimes they were splitting over race. I mean, there are a certain number of denominations that are historically black denominations. Very often is splitting over conservative versus liberal values, and in recent time, of course, splitting because charismatic or Pentecostal movements come in and end up dividing denominations as well. So a few five key factors that I want to talk about briefly that help to understand both the historical background of American Christianity, but also the way that things are today. At the core, I would say, is the liberal versus conservative division. This is still probably one of the most fundamental divisions between different churches and different denominations in the States. And so, because it's very easy to break off and start your own denomination, therefore most churches end up being fairly strongly liberal or fairly strongly conservative. The second point is the expansion of the Pentecostal charismatic movement over the years. The third issue, and this is particularly important, I think, to understand what's going on now, the broadening of the concept of a separation of church and state. The fourth, very important, the rise of the religious right since the 1980s. And then briefly, the issue of the fact that over time, American education has become very much divided, very clearly divided into secular schools and religious schools. So I'm going to talk about each one of these in a bit more detail. What we would consider liberalism in Christianity largely goes back to the movement that some of you may be familiar with called the social gospel. And the social gospel, which developed in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a feeling that at that time, sort of the broader kind of liberal movement that was already starting within the church and politically, it was too complacent, that people were not thinking enough about social issues. And so there was America at this point in time was also characterized by a movement that's usually referred to as progressivism. Progressivism basically thinks that you can make things better through social change, through education, through political means, but spiritual change is not part of that priority. And the movement within Christianity of social gospel reflected these values. They felt, and they were right to a large extent, that more conservative Christians were not paying enough attention to social reform, were not paying enough attention to things like ethics and social justice. And so they began to introduce these causes into Christianity at that point in time. But the consequence of this was that for these many more liberal groups, doing social ministry gradually replaced evangelism. That they came to see the social needs, which were very real in America at any point in time, they came to see meeting the social needs as more important than meeting the spiritual needs. And this was going to have very serious consequences for the way American Christianity has developed. At the beginning of the 20th century, partly in direct opposition to this was fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, as I think we know, and fundamentalism is one of those terms that has become now a little bit of a dirty word because we tend to use it in multiple contexts for different religions, and it's associated with very negative tendencies. Fundamentalism basically was a very, very conservative form of Christianity, focusing on very much on the Bible, on principles of biblical inerrancy, and pretty conservative beliefs across the board. And it was very much a reaction against liberalism and the social gospel. There were a group of American Christians who felt, and they were not wrong, that liberalism and the social gospel movement were moving away from the core doctrines of Christianity. And therefore, it was necessary to re-emphasize these core doctrines. They came out with a 12-volume set of readings called the Fundamentals. You can find these very easily if you Google them. They're available as soft copies online. They were basically a collection of articles reaffirming all of what were considered to be the important core beliefs at the time. And for generally speaking, for most of us Christians here, all of this would be very familiar territory. But because they felt, and again rightly, the need to reaffirm these core doctrines at the time through this publication. Therefore, the term fundamentals became fundamentalists and came to refer to, quite broadly, to conservative Christians in general. One of the first real confrontations between the fundamentalists and the more liberal forces in society was the famous Scopes trial of 1925. What had happened was that many states in America, and if this was the kind of thing that was regulated at the state level because we have a federal system, many states, even in the mid-20s, still banned the teaching of evolution. And so if you taught evolution in the school, then you could be criminally charged. And so a man named Scopes, a teacher in one of the southern states, basically decided to challenge this law and by teaching evolution. And that's why it was known as the Scopes monkey trial, because of course the monkey was the kind of symbol of anti-symbol of evolution. And so he was represented by William Jennings Bryan, who was actually kind of a populist, conservative Christian lawyer and political figure. And then the evolution side was represented by Clarence Darrow, who was a fairly liberal lawyer. And to make a long story short, the evolution side won, and it was decided that you could not reasonably ban the teaching of creation in schools. But this was kind of a landmark, because this was one of the first times where liberal and conservative Christian beliefs came into conflict in the public arena in America. This, of course, has become very common over the last century, but in many ways it started here. A second important phenomenon was the expansion over time of Pentecostal and charismatic churches. Now, I use the broad shorthand of using Pentecostal for full denominations that practice the Pentecostal gifts, and charismatic for the movement that starts inside other denominations. So we're largely talking about the same thing, but from two different perspectives. If you know anything about the history of Pentecostalism, you know that generally speaking, it's acknowledged as going back to very early 20th century Los Angeles, a revival that took place in a black church on Azusa Street in LA. And for much of the 20th century, Pentecostalism was largely a phenomenon either of black Americans or of generally rural America. It was only in the 1960s and 1970s that we really begin to see a major expansion of the charismatic and Pentecostal movement in the US. And the way that I usually describe it is that at this point in time, the Pentecostal movement, not only it went upscale because you began to have a lot more upper middle class Christians who practiced it, and it also jumped from predominantly black churches to white churches. The church that is often credited with starting the movement is an Episcopal church or Anglican church in California, which would have been very, very, very Ang Mo Pai kind of church. And then what happened gradually, as has happened in Singapore, was that it moved into various different denominations as well as the Catholic Church and became a permanent fixture of American Christianity, just as it has in Singapore. But it's very interesting the way that God really suddenly, in this period of time, God suddenly dramatically changed the whole pattern of American Christianity through the expansion of the Pentecostal gifts. So the consequence of this was that evangelical Christianity in general, because the expansion of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity was part of a broader expansion of what we can consider evangelical Christianity in the 1960s and 70s. If you went back to the 90s, 40s, and 50s, the American Christianity was still largely dominated by the traditional denominations. But in the 60s and 70s, things really begin to change, and the kind of gradual shrinking of the size of many of the more traditional liberal denominations is paired with the fact that much of church growth is occurring in the evangelical churches. And this is before the first megachurches appear, and then once the megachurches appear, they accelerate the process. So I would argue that this period also sees a significant shift of a balance of power between the more liberal churches and the more conservative churches in America. And from this point onward, truly liberal churches and denominations really begin to become more of a minority in American Christianity. And the evangelicals, because after a certain point, almost all conservative Christians would probably be considered evangelicals, whether or not they are charismatic. They come to be very much the dominant force and dominant voice in American Protestant Christianity. So this is another factor to keep in mind when we get to the present time. One of the key issues that is important, and is always, I think, very difficult for people who have not lived in the US to understand, is the idea of the principle of separation in church and state, and the way that it has been applied and the way that it has changed in the US over time. If you go back to the US Constitution, which is the original basis for the principle, the Constitution basically says two things. You cannot impose a religious test on anyone for public office, and this was a reflection of the European background that many of the founding fathers had come from, particularly the UK, or for Britain, where for a long time you had to be Anglican, and if you were anything else but, you were excluded from many jobs. So you cannot have a religious test for public office, and Congress cannot pass a law which either establishes a particular religion or prohibits religious freedom. That is all that the Constitution has to say on religion. But over time, this has considerably evolved and considerably broadened. Until about World War II, most Americans really didn't pay much attention to this issue. And there was quite a lot of Christianity in the public sphere, and generally speaking, this was accepted. It's only really in the late 50s and 1960s that this began to become an issue, and people began to push back against Christianity in the public sphere. I think most of us here understand the American system well enough to know that this is why the Supreme Court is so important. Because a lot of the issues covering religion in America, they're not covered by laws. They're covered by Supreme Court decisions. So for example, in the early 60s, at some point somewhere, some parents were upset because the Bible was being read in their children's classroom in school. And other parents were upset because there were prayers being said in their classroom in school. So then they sued the school system, and it goes through a series of decisions until it gets up to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court makes a decision: no prayer in schools, no Bible in schools, and that has the force of law. That's why there is always so much importance given to choosing Supreme Court justices. My memory is that I was in primary school a little bit later than that, and my memory is that we still did have occasional Bible reading and prayer. I think because I came from a small town, a bit more conservative, so I think some school systems operate on the principle that as long as nobody objects, we'll go ahead and do it. But gradually, by the early 70s, it became tougher and tougher, and over time, things have been, more and more areas of the public sphere had religion pushed out. And so increasingly in public ceremonies, especially in public space, again, growing up in the small town that I grew up in Pennsylvania, at Easter, when I was young, at Easter, you could put up a cross in the public square, which was where the main government buildings were. Or you could put up a Christmas tree. After a certain point in time, you couldn't do that anymore because people began to sue about putting up religious symbols on public land. Now, in some towns, America always being creative, they have an atheist tree put up beside the Christmas tree in the town square. So the atheist tree, the local atheist association, was allowed to put up a tree and then put little pamphlets and things like that on it. More recently, apparently now, if you are a practitioner of Wicca, you actually can officially put your symbol on military graves in a military cemetery. Because what is interesting is that on the one hand, certain specifically Christian symbols have been taken out of public space. Yet in other ways, all groups that can be considered as religion, and the Wicca people have generally made a case successfully that they should be seen as a religion, are able, in what space there is left, now the different groups like the Wicca are able to do this. I believe there was a legal case in Florida where the local Satan worshippers sued to have a display along with the Christmas tree. I think that one didn't get through. But the point is that it's religion, what is left of public space for religion gets defined more and more broadly. But generally speaking, many people, including myself, would argue that the original provisions of the American Constitution have been stretched quite a bit beyond what the original founders intended. So the consequence of this is that there has been tremendous amount of pushback from American Christians in recent years. There is a very strong feeling that because Christianity has been taken out of public space, that one of the things that now needs to be done is to try to put it back in, and this is part of the agenda of many evangelical groups. One of the most important factors, of course, is the rise of the religious right. And this term basically only comes in the 1980s. If you know modern American history, you know that ironically in 1976 we elected Jimmy Carter, who was the most truly, genuinely evangelical Christian president we've had, and perhaps the only one. But he was, because he was a Democrat, that made him too liberal in many people's eyes, and he also, to be honest, was a godly man, but not particularly good president. So, Christianity did not really start getting that politicized in the late 70s. It predominantly began in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. And Reagan, who himself was at best a kind of lukewarm Christian, and it was particularly it was a very big scandal when it was known that his wife consulted an astrologer to try to find out the future. So having the Christian president's wife consulting an astrologer was not very well viewed in some circles. The point is that from the 1980s, we see the very clear link between conservative Christianity and the Republican Party. And Reagan was the first president to really consciously court conservative Christians on any large scale, starting with Jerry Falwell, who was one of the most prominent conservative Christian voices at that point in time. And from that point, liberalism basically becomes a dirty word. It becomes a dirty word politically, and it becomes a dirty word religiously. And so the religious right sees itself as pushing back against the so-called liberal forces in society, whether they're political or whether they're moral. At the same time, very clearly, we see this direct involvement of religious leaders in political causes. Now, this is not to say that this never happened before the 1980s, but it has, broadly speaking, become more systematic, more common, and perhaps even almost assumed since that time. And the Democrats are stigmatized as a party of liberals by the people on the right. And the problem is that there is no counterweight to the religious right. And the Democrats, for reasons which I'll go into in a little while, the Democrats have a very hard time recruiting a support base among conservative Christians because they are always perceived as being too liberal. Now, I always say that I'm going to go back, and when I retire, I'll go back and start the religious middle, which will sort of counteract the religious right. I am actually wearing an Obama T-shirt under my batik because I am in fact a registered Democrat, and which is, of course, I like to say that as an evangelical Christian who is an elder in a BP church and is also a registered Democrat, I'm an extremely rare bird. And so I would have a very hard time finding a comfortable home, a church home back in the States. But anyway, we'll leave that out of it. So finally, the last point I want to make is and I think this is very important because it has implications for the general intellectual trends of American Christianity. As you may know, almost all American colleges and universities founded before probably about the mid-19th century virtually all of them were Christian. Almost all the universities had Christian roots. Then, later on, beginning in the late 19th century, you have the founding of, begin to have universities and schools that are explicitly secular. At the same time, many of the schools that were originally Christian or denominational become secularized. Now, I have chosen here the Cornell and Yale, which were the two schools where I had my education. Cornell is an example of a university that was founded as a secular university. Yale is an excellent example, like Harvard, of something that used to be a seminary to train Christian leaders and has become a very secular school. And then at the same time, over the course of the 20th century, there has been a multiplying of Christian colleges and universities like Liberty University that I have the seal there for. The consequences of this have been there has been a kind of vicious cycle that as the American academic world has become more secular, generally speaking, Christian academics have felt more isolated and even persecuted there, and they have tended to leave leave the secular universities and go to Christian schools. I always say that one of the things that I love about being an academic in Singapore is that NUS has a much higher percentage of Christians than probably any American secular university would. If I look at my own faculty, arts and social sciences, I can identify believers in almost every department. A couple of exceptions like Malay studies, not surprisingly, but in most departments we have believers, and one of my colleagues is here, from Prof. Lee So-an from economics. So this would be highly unusual at many secular schools in the States. And so therefore, because many Christian scholars and academics end up going to Christian schools, that means that the remaining schools are very, very secular. And at the same time, because the scholars at the Christian schools are not usually under the same kind of pressure, and the whole kind of ethos, if you pardon the expression, and the whole ethos of those schools is very different from the secular universities. And so as a result, I would argue, particularly if you compare to the UK, that Christian scholarship has become considerably weakened. You can see the differences very clearly if you look at Britain, because Britain basically doesn't really have Christian universities on any large scale. Instead, you also have Christians still teaching at Cambridge and Oxford and all of the other schools. So you can go to a British university and study, as a secular British university, and study church history and study church theology and have a reasonable chance of finding professors that actually believe it, right? Where if you go to an American secular university, you can study those topics, but it's very, very likely that you would be dealing with professors coming at things from a secular point of view. So that secular spiritual divide has been very important. All right, so to sum up the consequences before we move to the present time. So the deep-seated split between liberals on the one hand, conservatives, evangelicals on the other. This split, the spiritual split, becomes mapped to Democratic-Republican rivalry. It is virtually assumed that if you are a conservative Christian, evangelical, you're going to be a Republican. Conversely, someone like me, again, is very rare. There are simply very, very few evangelicals that are supporters of Democrats. And what I see as one of the most serious problems is that the original kind of fundamentalist opposition to the idea of social gospel, this term becomes thrown around very often about social ministry in general. And so the result is that many of the Christians who are doing real social ministry are actually from the liberal side, whereas those who are more conservative and evangelical are usually mainly doing evangelism. And the connection between the two, to have a social ministry with an evangelistic focus, to a large extent that has been lost. Not completely, but to a large extent. And so evangelicals are linked to conservative causes and conservative values. And then anything that is linked to social justice, to issues of racism, even to the academic world in general, becomes stigmatized as liberal or woke. Now, of course, I'm making fairly broad generalizations here, but this holds true for quite a bit of the landscape in the US. And finally, there is a very strong, what I would call, persecution complex. Even though, American Christians are very vocal and have quite a bit of influence and a fair amount of clout, yet there is always this sense that, the liberals are out to get us, right? They've taken Christianity out of the schools, they're trying to change the morality of the society, and this kind of sense of persecution complex, I think in many ways is not healthy, because it creates a kind of militancy that often sends people in the wrong directions. All right, so now, what lessons can we learn from this? First of all, I think it's extremely important to maintain intellectual engagement. And some of you may be familiar with this book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll, who's one of the very few sort of evangelical academic historians. And he writes both about the history of Christianity, but also this book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. This phrase, which you can see on a lot of bumper stickers, either God said it or the Bible said it, one or the other. I believe it, and that settles it. Now, I certainly am not going to attack the authority of Scripture as God's word, but even so, we would agree that this is a very simplistic kind of perspective. So, first of all, I think it is important to do exactly what Christians through ETHOS and other groups in Singapore are doing, to be speaking up as part of civil society, with emphasis on civil in both meanings. A lot of what American Christians, particularly conservative Christians, say is not civil, and that is a core part of the problem. And it's also not, often it is not particularly intellectually grounded. Second, this is something that I constantly emphasize, starting with my own church. It's extremely important in Singapore for us to train our youth and our young adults to be thinking Christians. I spend most of my life with 20-somethings. I'm single, I don't have a family. I spend much of my time with present students, former students, and young adults from my church. And one of the most, I talk to a lot of Christian students from various backgrounds. One of the most common things that I hear from them is we'll be talking something like, let's say, the issue of creation versus evolution, or talking about LGBT issues, and they'll say, Prof, I don't get to talk about these things in my church. We don't get to raise these questions. It is extremely important for all of our churches to be raising these questions with youth and young adults. One of the things that I'm quite proud of in my own church is that we have been very intentional about doing this. We cannot simply give our youth and young adults a few Bible verses and say that this is what you have to stand on. And we have to be able to talk them through things. If issues, let's say, like creation versus evolution, there is not one single clear biblical position. Creation versus evolution is not like the resurrection, right? The resurrection, there's no argument. But we know that you can be a biblically based Christian and have a wide variety of views on the scale from of any kind of combination of creation or evolution. And so it's very important for us not to teach our youth and young adults on something that there is only one position on, when in fact there is not. They have to be able to think. And if we do not allow them to think, when they get into the universities will do the thinking for them. And I say this as an academic. And so if the only places that our youth and young adults get to think about things and talk through issues is in a predominantly secular academic world, unless they're sitting and talking to a Christian prof like me, then we're going to be in trouble. So the more that our schools, the more that our churches do to prepare them for these issues, and again, it doesn't just mean throwing some Bible verses at them and saying, this is the biblical position on this. Many of these key issues cannot simply be handled with a few Bible verses. So this is the first thing that I think is important for all levels of Christian society in Singapore. Second, we need to show love, not phobias. And the very basic question is, what would Jesus say and do? You think about Jesus in the Gospels. You think about the way that he deals with the Samaritan woman. You think about the way that he deals with people with various kinds of struggles. Do we really think that he is going to be hostile to someone simply because of their sexual orientation? And particularly the kind of homophobia that has come up in American Christianity, it has made it very, very difficult for Christians to have any kind of ministry to LGBT people. Too much damage has been done. When AIDS first showed up in the 1980s, AIDS was, of course, a tremendously serious health issue that a lot of people were affected by. It would have been a very good chance for evangelical Christians to minister to people and show love. Instead, they spent most of the time proclaiming that this was God's punishment on people for being gay. And that was not much of a witness. So I think that we really, really want to be like Jesus in the way that we talk to people of all backgrounds and the way that we behave towards them. The signs on the right, some you may be familiar with. There's a particular church out in the Midwest somewhere that their belief is that everything bad that happens to America is because of homosexuality. And so during the various wars, like the Gulf Wars, the Afghanistan War, whenever a soldier is killed, they will go and protest outside the funeral, claiming that this soldier was killed in the war because of the permissive attitude towards homosexuality in the US. Now, you can imagine what kind of public image that gives evangelical Christianity. I mean, these people, you know, they're basically wackos, all right? But this is the side many people come to see, that see them as being typical rather than being exceptional. And what message do we want to send? You know, do we want to send a message against something or people, or do we want to send a message to try to bring people closer to God? And what do we want them to see? Fundamentally, are we condemning or are we reaching out? And I think this applies not just to people, obviously, with LGBT, but in other situations as well. And I think that very often we spend, not so much we in Singapore, but American Christians have spent huge amounts of time preaching against specific groups of people without giving them any sense that God might actually love them and help them to deal with their sins. And then what happens is at the other extreme, then you get the more liberal Christians that say, well, God loves you no matter what, and you don't need to change your life or do anything differently. And then there is no loving evangelical biblical voice in between. And this is one of the core problems with American Christian society. A third point, what are the real issues confronting our society? Now, I think, and I am thinking, and I'm going to talk a little at some length about this, the way that American Christians have handled the LGBT issue, I think in many ways has been wrong and has done a lot of damage to, again, to our ability to show God to people that are in this kind of situation, living these lives. So first of all, we need to avoid knee-jerk reactions. Don't just have, you know, oh, you're this, therefore I respond in that way. We have to have more kind of nuanced, subtle reactions. One of the things, the arguments that American Christians have frequently made is that over the last couple of decades, that homosexuality has threatened or destroyed the American family. If you look at it, the American family has been destroyed by promiscuity, by infidelity, by divorce, by adultery, and it has nothing to do with homosexuality. The American family was in many ways seriously damaged by the sexual revolution and other events of the 1960s and 1970s. And you may know that the divorce rate is virtually as high among American Christians as it is anywhere else. So my own feeling is that the gay community has been in some ways stigmatized by American Christians. They'd much rather point at these people as a threat than look at what has been happening in the rest of society and within American Christianity. So I think we have, and I'm not making any, I'm not going to get into any comment on what's going on in Singapore, on the Constitution, on 3778. I'm a foreigner, I'm not going to comment on those things. But I just want to point out we want to be really careful how we define where is a real threat, okay, and what are the real problems that we're facing in society. It's very easy sometimes to zero in on one particular group of people who are perhaps more vocal or trying to change things, and we do not want to sort of stigmatize or scapegoat one particular group if there are broader issues going on. If you look at the number of scandals that have hit American Christian leaders over the last few decades, and I think if some of you, my fellow Americans here, you remember the televangelists back in the 1980s. None of that involved homosexuality. Okay, these were very prominent men that were playing around with prostitutes and adultery of various kinds. more recently, Ravi Zacharias, all of these things are going on. And virtually every scandal that has hit any pastor or Christian leader in the States, it has been a man with another woman. It has not been a man with a man. So we want to recognize where the real issues are and the real threats are, and look at sexual purity and sexual fidelity in a very broad sense and not at any one group. And the other thing I mentioned a couple minutes ago, that I think it's very easy when someone raises up an issue of racism, for example. We know racism is still a serious problem in American society. Nobody can deny this. And it has been a problem. Several years ago, there were a group of white American evangelical leaders that basically made a kind of public confession to their black brothers and sisters, saying, well, we're sorry, over the years we have not dealt with this problem. But even now, if you bring up issues of racism, then you say, oh, that's just a woke culture, or you're just liberals. We cannot avoid dealing with real problems by simply taking a label like liberal or woke and putting on them. And I think we always have, when someone is raising an issue, we always have to look at what's behind it. Now again, this is much less true in Singapore than it is in America, but it's still sometimes the way that if we have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction and see, well, yes, you bring this issue up because you have this agenda, and we don't always ask ourselves, is there a real problem behind it that we need to be thinking about? Certainly, the importance of social justice and social ministry is very clear. I mentioned the divide that had come up over the decades between more conservative Christians and more liberal Christians. One of the most influential books that was written back, I think, in the 70s, Ronald Sider, who just recently passed away, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. That was a book that impacted me tremendously when I was in university. And he was one of the first evangelical writers to really challenge American Christians on their lifestyle. Now, not everybody went along with it. So someone else wrote Productive Christians in an Age of Guilt Manipulators, a biblical response to Ronald Sider, because many people accused him of kind of laying a guilt trip on his fellow Christians. But the number of evangelicals that are really concerned about issues of social justice and social ministry in America is still pretty small. And this is another thing that I think has really harmed the collective witness in American society. Now, this one is extremely important. And again, this is a very American thing. I do not see it happening here. But there has been a tendency from conservative Christians that when you look at a political leader, you assess them on two points. How do they feel about abortion? How do they feel about gay marriage? These are not the only criteria for a good leader. And therefore, the gentleman in the middle, holding the Bible, has done an extremely good job of hoodwinking people, Christians, into believing that he actually cares about these things, right? I mean, how many of us really believe that if one of the many women in his life had gotten pregnant, that he would have not had an abortion so fast it would have made your hand spin? Of course he would have done that, right? But yet he's managed to convince a whole lot of people that, yes, he actually cares about the unborn. And therefore, because he's managed to convince people this, he's gotten a lot of support. Conversely, Obama, who was in many ways a much more godly man, was consistently stigmatized. I mean, I had somebody in my church tell me, well, Obama can't be a Christian because, he's pro-abortion and he's pro-gay marriage. Well, those are not the only characteristics that we use to decide someone's faith. And so, of course, there were people. One of my Christian students years ago, he was telling me, yeah, Prof, he said, I had this big argument with my mother-in-law because she came home from her church and said that, oh, yes, Obama's the Antichrist. And so I had to try to convince her that he wasn't. And I found, incidentally, so the Antichrist's most devoted followers will wear a sign of their allegiance to him on their foreheads. And we all thought it was going to be a barcode or a chip. Now, I'm not claiming that people wearing MAGA hats on their forehead I'm not going to go so far as to say that he who shall not be named is the Antichrist. But I thought this was pretty funny, even so. And if you Google him and Antichrist, you'll find almost as many memes and pictures as you will if you put Obama instead. But the main point we know in Singapore we have a lot of very good men and women in leadership who are not Christian. And we cannot, and again, I don't think Singaporeans are doing this, but we cannot look at leaders and choose leaders based only on their supposed religious beliefs if in many other ways they do not have the character as a leader. And this is one very serious problem that we have developed. Kind of finally, to wrap things up, evangelical in some ways has become a bit of a dirty word. It used to be just fundamentalist. Fundamentalist originally was the insult. Evangelical still can. But in the last few years, evangelical has become almost as bad as fundamentalists. And so the Ronald Siders group, which used to be Evangelicals for Social Action, is now Christians for Social Action, simply because they felt that evangelicals had become too negative a term. So why is this the case? It's because American evangelicals have been consistently speaking up, making noise, taking positions that had a negative impact on public opinion. And it was not simply that they were taking biblical positions, but they were taking positions which in some ways were biblical, but were expressed in very hostile and very unloving ways, and in ways which did not always honor God. And to my mind, that is the fundamental problem. So I want to conclude with reasons for optimism for the Singaporean case. I mean, I've lived here almost 25 years. I'm a church leader. I think that I can speak pretty accurately about Singaporean Christianity. First of all, the fact that we have a strong Christian presence in schools and universities. I think this is very important because Christians here are not sort of segregated or isolated off in specifically Christian institutions. You're part of the mainstream school and educational environment, and I think that is very important. We have overall a critical mass of well-educated Christians, which is also important. Obviously, there are certainly well-educated American evangelicals, but at the same time, a lot of the people that are especially most vocal are very often not so well-educated, and comes across very clearly, unfortunately, when they're being interviewed by CNN and things like that. I think that many Christians here do have a vision for social ministry. I think that the idea that we would just stigmatize something as kind of social gospel, I think that's generally not the case in Singapore, which is very good. One of the things that I appreciate most in Singapore is the fact that you can have partnerships between the government and the church. This is virtually impossible in the US because of these prohibitions. So my church, for example, we work with the RCs in several HDB blocks to bring vouchers and visit and support poor families, and to build relationships with them and give them support of various kinds, and we have tuition for the kids at church and things like that. That kind of partnership would not be possible in the States. You could not have basically a church working with a government organization, in most cases, to go and take care of people. And so I think this kind of partnership is a very, very good thing, and it opens a lot of doors for ministry if we know how to handle it correctly. I think the Maintaining Religious Harmony Act, the MRHA, I think is very important. This will be my only political statement on Singapore. I have a lot of respect for MRHA. I think it's very good. A few years ago, I supervised an honors thesis for a student that was writing about the origins of the MRHA. Now, he was Christian. He became an MFA diplomat, and he's now serving in a Muslim country in the Singaporean embassy. So he's living out the MRHA. But I have a lot of respect for it because I think it does a very good job of managing interreligious sentiments and managing religious tensions in Singapore. It wouldn't work in American society because we have different kinds of parameters. But I honestly believe that MRHA keeps, especially by keeping limitations on hate speech, I think it's a very, very good thing. And one of the reasons that I think that we have relatively more harmony among different religious groups in Singapore is precisely because Christians cannot get up and talk about burning the Quran or doing all the stupid things that American Christians like to do. And so I think that this really is a good thing for Singapore. And finally, I think because we live in a multi-religious society and we have a very high degree of religious freedom, we have a lot of opportunities as Christians to make an impact. So these are the positive things. Then the negative things I have already given you, the lessons to learn, and with that I will conclude. Thank you.